If I don't get to that operating room in the next 20 minutes, a woman is going to die. Dr. Nia Brooks' voice cut through the humid Atlanta afternoon like a blade through glass, but nobody seemed willing to listen. The flashing blue lights reflected across the windshield of her silver sedan, painting the crowded intersection in pulses of cold color. Around her, engines idled. Horns sounded in the distance. A helicopter thumped faintly somewhere above the skyline. Nia tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her heart hammered against her ribs. She had performed emergency procedures before. She had made impossible decisions before. But never like this. Never while the clock was slipping away second by second. The phone resting on the passenger seat vibrated again. The hospital. She already knew what they would say before she answered. The patient's condition was deteriorating. The surgical team was assembled. The operating room was ready. Only one person was missing. Her. A uniformed officer stepped toward her vehicle. His expression remained firm, professional, unreadable. Nia lowered the window immediately. "Officer, please," she said. "I'm a trauma surgeon at St. Matthew's Medical Center. I'm being called in for an emergency operation." The officer glanced at her identification, then back at her face. Traffic crawled behind him. The heat shimmered above the asphalt. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle." For a moment, Nia simply stared. She thought she had misheard him. "There has to be some mistake," she replied. "I have credentials. The hospital can verify everything." Another patrol car rolled to a stop nearby. The atmosphere changed instantly. Drivers began slowing to watch. People standing outside a nearby gas station turned their attention toward the growing scene. Nia felt dozens of eyes settling onto her. She swallowed hard. "Officer, I understand you have a job to do," she said carefully. "But someone is waiting for me right now. This surgery can't be delayed." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. Neither man seemed interested in the urgency behind her words. The radio attached to one officer's shoulder crackled with static and clipped voices. Somewhere downtown, another siren wailed. The city kept moving. Time kept moving. But for Nia, everything felt frozen. She stepped out slowly, the late summer air wrapping around her like a blanket of heat. Her white medical coat remained folded neatly across the passenger seat. The embroidered letters beneath her name shimmered in the sunlight. MD, trauma surgery. Years of education. Years of sacrifice. Years spent saving strangers she would never meet again. None of it seemed to matter in this moment. Her phone rang once more. The bright screen displayed a single word. Operating room. Nia closed her eyes for half a second before answering. "Dr. Brooks," a strained voice said immediately. "The patient's blood pressure is falling. We need you here now." Nia looked toward the officers standing only a few feet away. Then she looked toward the Atlanta skyline, rising beyond the traffic. Glass towers glowed beneath the afternoon sun. Somewhere inside one of those buildings, a family was waiting. Somewhere inside St. Matthew's, a woman was fighting for her life. And neither the officers surrounding Dr. Nia Brooks nor the growing crowd gathering along the sidewalk had the slightest idea that the woman lying between life and death was the police chief's wife. The call ended, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any words. Dr. Nia Brooks lowered the phone from her ear and stared at the dark screen for a moment. Around her, traffic continued inching forward beneath the blazing Georgia sun. The smell of hot pavement drifted through the air. Somewhere nearby, a delivery truck released a long hiss of compressed brakes. Life moved normally for everyone else. For Nia, every passing second carried the weight of a life she had sworn to protect. One of the officers stepped closer. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." His voice remained controlled, but firm. Nia inhaled slowly. Years of emergency medicine had taught her how to remain calm when everyone else was panicking. She had delivered devastating news to families. She had guided frightened patients through impossible moments. She had stood beside operating tables for 16 hours without sitting down, yet standing on the side of a busy Atlanta street, unable to reach a patient who desperately needed her, felt strangely unbearable. She glanced toward the hospital skyline barely 3 miles away. 3 miles. Under normal conditions, it was a 7-minute drive. Today it might as well have been across the country. "Officer," she said carefully, "please allow me one more call." The officers exchanged a brief look before one of them nodded. Nia immediately dialed the direct line to St. Matthew's Surgical Center. The call connected after a single ring. "Dr. Brooks?" a voice answered. It was Karen Ellis, the operating room coordinator. Her normally steady voice sounded strained. Karen, listen carefully, Nia said. I am being delayed. How is the patient? There was a pause. Papers shuffled in the background. Medical equipment beeped faintly through the line. She is stable for the moment, Karen replied. But the surgical window is narrowing. We need you here as soon as possible. Nia closed her eyes. The words struck harder than she expected. Stable for the moment. In trauma medicine, those 4 words could change in an instant. Tell Dr. Patel to keep the team ready, Nia said. I am doing everything I can. Everyone is waiting for you, Karen replied quietly. When the call ended, Nia slipped the phone into her pocket. The officers remained watching her. One appeared younger than the others, perhaps no older than 30. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. You really are a surgeon? He asked. Nia nodded. Trauma and emergency surgery. The young officer looked down at the identification badge still resting in his hand. The photo showed Nia wearing blue scrubs beneath bright operating room lights. Nothing about her expression looked different from now. The same determination, the same focus, the same calm eyes. How long have you been a doctor? He asked quietly. 14 years. The officer hesitated. Why emergency medicine? For the first time since the ordeal began, Nia's expression softened slightly. She looked beyond the flashing patrol lights toward the distant city skyline. Because when someone is having the worst day of their life, they deserve someone who is willing to fight for them. The young officer said nothing. Nearby, a radio crackled again. Another unit checking in. Another routine update. Yet something about the atmosphere felt different now. The confidence that had surrounded the situation earlier seemed to be fading. Then a black SUV appeared at the far end of the intersection. Its emergency lights flashed silently behind the windshield. Within seconds, every officer on scene turned toward it. The vehicle came to a stop, and a senior commander stepped out carrying a phone pressed tightly against his ear. His face had gone pale. The commander ended the call before the SUV door had fully closed behind him. His polished shoes struck the pavement with quick, purposeful steps as he crossed the intersection. The flashing lights reflected across the lenses of his sunglasses, but they could not hide the tension etched into his face. Every officer nearby straightened instinctively. The casual certainty that had filled the scene only minutes earlier had vanished. What is happening here? The commander asked. His voice was calm, yet carried the weight of authority that immediately silenced the surrounding chatter. One of the officers stepped forward and began explaining the situation. The commander listened without interrupting. His expression remained unreadable until his gaze shifted toward Dr. Nia Brooks. He studied her for a moment. The white coat folded inside her vehicle, the hospital credentials, the exhaustion behind her eyes. Then he looked back at the officer. You stopped a trauma surgeon responding to an emergency? The officer cleared his throat. Sir, we were following procedure. The commander nodded slowly. Procedure. He repeated the word as though weighing it carefully. Then his phone vibrated again. This time he answered immediately. The officers could hear only fragments of the conversation. Yes, Chief. A pause. No, sir. Another pause. She is still here. The commander removed his sunglasses. Suddenly, everyone seemed to understand that something far bigger than a routine traffic stop was unfolding. Nia stood quietly, listening. The name caught her attention. Chief. There could only be one person on the other end of that call. Police Chief Richard Bennett. A respected figure throughout Atlanta. A man known for leadership during difficult moments. A man who, at this exact second, was waiting at St. Matthew's Medical Center beside a hospital bed. The commander listened for another few seconds before responding. Yes, Chief. I understand. Then he ended the call and lowered the phone. The intersection felt strangely quiet despite the traffic. Even the air seemed heavier. The commander turned toward Nia. Dr. Brooks. Yes. The patient you were scheduled to operate on. He paused. Do you know her identity? Nia shook her head. No. Trauma cases are assigned based on urgency. I only received the surgical briefing. The commander exhaled slowly. The patient is Eleanor Bennett. Nia recognized the name immediately, not because of politics, not because of public attention, because she had reviewed the medical file less than an hour earlier. Complicated injuries, significant internal concerns, a procedure requiring precise timing and experience, the kind of case that left little room for delay. Chief Bennett's wife, the young officer whispered. The words seemed to settle over the scene like a sudden fog. No one spoke for several seconds. The commander looked directly at the officers who had stopped her. None of them met his eyes. The chief has been waiting outside that operating room for nearly an hour, the commander said quietly. And the surgeon he has been waiting for has been standing here the entire time. Nia did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel anger. If anything, she felt only the pressure of time. Every minute spent talking was another minute lost. Her phone rang once more. She answered immediately. Dr. Brooks, Karen's voice said. We need a decision. The team cannot wait much longer. Nia turned slightly away from the officers. The sunlight glinted across the hospital towers in the distance. Tell them I am coming, she said. Tell them to hold everything together for 10 more minutes. When she lowered the phone, the commander had already opened the rear door of his SUV. His expression carried none of the authority from before. Only urgency remained. Doctor, he said, please get in. We are taking you to the hospital ourselves. The SUV accelerated through downtown Atlanta beneath a chorus of sirens and flashing lights. Buildings of glass and steel slid past the windows in blurred reflections. Traffic parted ahead as officers cleared a path through crowded streets that only minutes earlier had felt impossible to escape. Dr. Nia Brooks sat in the rear seat with her phone pressed against her ear, reviewing medical notes while the city rushed by outside. Her focus never wavered. Every lab result, every scan, every detail mattered. Across from her, the commander remained silent, occasionally glancing toward her with an expression that mixed concern and regret. Finally he spoke. Doctor, I owe you an apology. Nia continued reviewing the patient file for several seconds before looking up. Right now, the patient is what matters. The commander nodded slowly. Even after everything, Nia lowered the tablet resting on her lap. Sunlight flickered across her face as the vehicle passed beneath an overpass. People do not stop needing help because someone else made a mistake. The commander looked away toward the passing skyline. Her answer seemed to settle heavily in the vehicle. A few moments later, the hospital appeared ahead. St. Matthew's Medical Center rose above the surrounding buildings, its glass exterior glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Ambulances waited near the emergency entrance. Medical staff moved through automatic doors carrying charts and equipment. The entire building seemed alive with urgency. As the SUV approached, another black vehicle was already waiting near a restricted entrance. A tall man stood beside it. His suit jacket hung open. His shoulders appeared rigid from hours of tension. Even from a distance, exhaustion was written across his face. Chief Richard Bennett. The moment the SUV stopped, he stepped forward. Nia exited first, carrying her tablet and medical notes. The chief looked directly at her. For a second, neither person spoke. The noise of the city faded beneath the hum of hospital generators and distant traffic. Dr. Brooks? He asked. Yes. His eyes briefly closed. Relief washed across his expression so suddenly that it almost looked painful. Thank you for coming. Nia noticed the strain in his voice. The sleeplessness. The fear. She had seen it countless times before in family members waiting outside operating rooms. Wealth did not change it. Authority did not change it. Everyone looked the same when someone they loved was in danger. How is she? Nia asked. The chief swallowed. The team says she is holding on. Holding on. The same fragile phrase again. Nia nodded once and immediately started toward the entrance. Then she stopped. Chief Bennett. He turned. I cannot promise outcomes. Her voice remained calm and honest. I can only promise that I will do everything possible. For the first time, emotion broke through his controlled expression. His eyes glistened slightly beneath the afternoon light. That is all I am asking. Nia disappeared through the hospital doors. Inside, controlled urgency filled every hallway. Nurses moved quickly between departments. Elevators opened and closed. Monitors beeped steadily behind patient room doors. Karen Ellis was already waiting. Dr. Brooks. Relief flooded her face. Operating room 3 is ready. Nia handed over her belongings without slowing down. Brief me on any changes. Karen immediately began updating her as they walked. New imaging. Updated vital signs. Adjustments to the surgical plan. Nia absorbed every detail. By the time they reached the operating floor, her focus had narrowed completely. The events outside no longer mattered. The delay no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was the woman waiting beyond the operating room doors. Meanwhile, several floors below, Chief Bennett stood motionless near a window overlooking the city. The commander approached quietly. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, the chief asked a simple question. Was she treated fairly? The commander looked down. The silence that followed gave him his answer. The red indicator above Operating Room 3 remained illuminated as minutes stretched into hours. Outside, the surgical waiting area felt suspended between hope and fear. Soft lighting reflected across polished floors. Coffee sat untouched on side tables. Television screens mounted on distant walls played silent news broadcasts that nobody watched. Chief Richard Bennett sat alone near a large window overlooking the city. The Atlanta skyline glowed beneath the fading afternoon sun, but he barely noticed it. His attention remained fixed on the closed operating room doors at the end of the hallway. Every time a nurse appeared, he looked up. Every time footsteps echoed across the floor, his heart quickened. Yet the doors remained closed. Beside him, the commander stood quietly. He had offered coffee twice. The chief declined both times. Finally, after nearly an hour of silence, Richard spoke. "Tell me exactly what happened." The commander knew immediately what he meant. He lowered himself into a nearby chair. The officers believed they were following protocol. Richard stared ahead. "That was not my question." The commander swallowed. Dr. Brooks identified herself immediately. She explained that she was responding to an emergency. Richard's jaw tightened. And the officers did not believe the situation was urgent enough to alter their actions. Silence returned. Somewhere down the hallway, an elevator chimed softly. A family passed carrying flowers. Life continued around them, indifferent to the weight pressing against Richard's chest. "Did she argue?" he finally asked. "No." "Did she become disrespectful?" "No, Chief." The commander hesitated. "She remained professional the entire time." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. For years he had built a career around leadership, accountability, fairness, principles he spoke about at press conferences and community meetings. Yet now those principles felt personal in a way they never had before. A woman trying to save his wife's life had been delayed while doing exactly what she was trained to do. The thought sat heavily inside him. Several floors above, the atmosphere inside the operating suite remained entirely different. Bright surgical lights illuminated a room filled with concentration and precision. Monitors displayed vital information. Medical staff moved with calm efficiency. Dr. Nia Brooks stood at the center of it all. Hours of pressure seemed to disappear the moment she entered the room. Her voice remained steady, her instructions clear, every decision deliberate. The delay outside had vanished from her mind. She focused only on the patient before her. Throughout her career, Nia had learned that medicine demanded complete presence. There was no room for resentment, no room for distraction. Every patient deserved the same effort regardless of status, wealth, or influence. Eleanor Bennett was no exception. Time passed. The afternoon faded into evening. The golden light outside the hospital windows softened into shades of orange and blue. In the waiting area, Richard remained exactly where he had been. He had not eaten. He had barely spoken. Then, at last, movement appeared at the end of the hallway. The operating room doors opened. Medical staff emerged one by one. Conversations immediately stopped. Richard rose so quickly that his chair slid backward across the floor. His pulse thundered in his ears. Finally, Dr. Nia Brooks stepped through the doors. Her surgical cap remained in place. Fatigue showed beneath her eyes, yet her posture remained calm. For a moment, the entire hallway seemed to hold its breath. Richard took several steps forward. The commander stood beside him. Nurses paused nearby. Everyone waited. Nia removed her gloves and looked directly at the chief. Then, after the longest few seconds of his life, a small smile appeared on her face. "Your wife is stable." For a moment, nobody moved. The words seemed to float in the air, settling slowly over the waiting area like the first rays of sunlight after a long storm. Richard Bennett closed his eyes and released a breath he felt he had been holding for hours. His shoulders lowered. The tension that had hardened every line of his face finally loosened. Around him, nurses smiled quietly. A few members of the surgical team exchanged relieved glances. Even the commander standing nearby looked as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. Dr. Nia Brooks remained calm despite the exhaustion pulling at her features. Long procedures always left traces behind. Her legs ached. Her shoulders felt heavy. The bright operating room lights still lingered in her vision. Yet seeing relief spread across a family's face never stopped mattering. It was one of the reasons she had chosen medicine in the first place. Richard stepped forward. His eyes glistened beneath the soft hospital lighting. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words sounded inadequate even to him. Nia offered a small nod. "The procedure went well. The next 24 hours will be important, but she is stable." Richard lowered his head for a moment. "You saved her life." Nia glanced toward the hallway leading back to the operating suites. An entire team helped save her life. Her answer carried no pride, no attempt to claim credit, only honesty. The chief noticed that immediately. He had spent years meeting people who rushed toward recognition. Yet the woman standing before him seemed almost uncomfortable receiving praise. A nurse approached and informed Richard that he could briefly see his wife in recovery. Emotion crossed his face again. He thanked the nurse and turned back toward Nia. "I do not know how to repay what you have done today." Nia's expression softened. "Go be with your wife." Richard nodded slowly before following the nurse down the hallway. The waiting area gradually emptied. Conversations resumed. Phones rang. The normal rhythm of hospital life returned. Nia finally lowered herself into a chair near the window. Outside, evening had settled over Atlanta. The sky glowed deep blue beyond the city lights. Cars moved like streams of white and red beneath the darkening horizon. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to sit still. The silence felt almost unfamiliar. A paper cup of coffee appeared beside her. She looked up. The young officer from earlier stood there. The same officer who had questioned her at the intersection. He seemed nervous now, almost uncomfortable. "I was not sure if you drank coffee," he admitted. Nia looked at the cup and smiled faintly. "After today, I definitely do." He laughed softly, though the smile quickly faded. "Dr. Brooks, I wanted to say something." Nia waited. The officer looked down at the polished floor before meeting her eyes again. "I should have listened." The honesty in his voice surprised her. No excuses. No attempts to justify himself. Just regret. Nia studied him for a moment. Through the nearby window, city lights reflected across the glass like scattered stars. "Listening is harder than most people think," she said. "Especially when we believe we already know the answer." The officer nodded slowly. Her words seemed to strike deeper than a lecture ever could. For several seconds, neither spoke. The hospital around them hummed quietly with life. Then the officer looked toward the recovery wing where the chief had disappeared. "You still saved her," he said. Nia followed his gaze. She needed help. The officer shook his head slightly, as though trying to understand how someone could choose compassion after such a day. But Nia was already looking out the window again, watching the lights of Atlanta shimmer beneath the night sky. The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows of St. Matthew's Medical Center, washing the hallways in warm gold. The tension that had gripped the building the previous day had softened into cautious optimism. Nurses moved between stations carrying charts and tablets. Families gathered around coffee carts. Somewhere down the corridor, quiet laughter drifted from a patient room. Life was returning to normal. Dr. Nia Brooks stepped out of an elevator shortly after 7 o'clock in the morning, already reviewing updates on her tablet. She had slept less than 4 hours. It was not unusual. Medicine rarely respected schedules. What surprised her was the sight waiting outside her office. Chief Richard Bennett stood near the window overlooking the city. Beside him were the commander and the young officer from the traffic stop. All three men looked as though they had arrived early and waited patiently. Nia slowed her pace. The chief stepped forward first. "Dr. Brooks." She nodded politely. "Chief." For a moment, he seemed unsure how to begin. The confidence that made him a respected leader across Atlanta was nowhere to be found. Instead, he looked like a husband who had almost lost someone he loved. "My wife is awake," he said quietly. A small smile appeared on Nia's face. "That is good news." Richard nodded. "The first thing she asked about was the doctor who helped her." He paused. "She wanted me to thank you." Nia accepted the words with a simple nod. Then the chief looked toward the commander. Without speaking, the commander handed him a folder. Richard held it carefully before offering it to Nia. "Last night, after I left recovery, I requested a full review of everything that happened." Nia looked down at the folder but did not open it. "Chief, that is not necessary." "It is necessary to me." His voice remained calm. "Because what I discovered was not simply a mistake." Silence settled between them. Sunlight reflected across the polished floor. The commander lowered his eyes. The young officer stood rigidly beside him. Richard continued. The report showed that you identified yourself immediately. It showed that your credentials were verified. It showed that your explanation was clear. His jaw tightened slightly. And yet you were still not heard. Nia remained quiet. The chief looked out toward the skyline for a moment. Yesterday, I kept asking myself a question. He turned back toward her. Would things have happened differently if someone else had been standing there? The hallway seemed to grow still. No one rushed to answer. No one pretended not to understand what he meant. Richard exhaled slowly. I have spent years talking about fairness, about trust, about treating people with dignity. His eyes settled on the floor briefly. Yesterday, I realized that believing in those values is not the same as seeing every failure to live up to them. The young officer swallowed hard. The commander looked away toward the window. Nia studied the chief's face. There was no defensiveness there. No attempt to protect reputations. Only honesty. My wife is alive because you chose to focus on helping her instead of focusing on what happened to you, Richard said. That realization is going to stay with me for a very long time. Nia finally spoke. People reveal who they are when they have power, but they also reveal who they are when they are afraid. Richard nodded slowly. Her words struck him harder than any criticism could have. Because he knew she was right. Yesterday, fear had filled the officers. Fear of making the wrong decision. Fear of breaking procedure. Yet somehow, in all that fear, they had stopped seeing the person standing in front of them. And that was the truth none of them could ignore anymore. 3 days later, the conference room at police headquarters felt very different from the tense hospital corridors where their paths had crossed. Morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long bands of light across polished wood tables and neatly arranged chairs. Senior officers filled the room. Community leaders sat along one side. Representatives from city departments occupied the remaining seats. At the front stood Chief Richard Bennett. Beside him was a large display screen showing a single phrase: building trust through accountability. The room quieted as Richard stepped forward. His wife was recovering well. Color had returned to her face. Her laughter had returned to their home. Every morning since the surgery felt like a gift he had nearly lost. And he knew exactly why. Thank you all for being here, he began. His voice carried clearly across the room. Today is not about policies on paper. It is about people. Several attendees exchanged curious glances. Richard continued. A few days ago, someone in this city needed help. Someone with the skills to save a life was delayed because assumptions were made before facts were considered. The room remained silent. Nobody missed the seriousness in his tone. Richard looked toward the first row. Dr. Nia Brooks sat quietly among the invited guests. She had almost declined the invitation. Public attention had never interested her, but the chief had personally asked her to attend. Out of respect, she agreed. Dr. Brooks, Richard said, turning toward her, would you please join me? Nia hesitated briefly before standing. As she walked toward the front of the room, dozens of eyes followed her. Yet she carried herself exactly as she always had. Calm, composed, unassuming. Richard waited until she reached the stage area. Then he addressed the room once more. Many people know titles. Chief, Commander, Doctor, Officer. He paused. But titles mean very little if we stop seeing the human being behind them. The words settled heavily across the audience. The commander sitting near the front lowered his gaze. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard continued. Dr. Brooks had every reason to leave that day feeling angry. He glanced toward her. Instead, she chose professionalism, compassion, service. Nia looked down briefly. The attention clearly made her uncomfortable. Richard smiled slightly. My wife is alive because of those choices. The room erupted into applause. It started with a few people, then more joined. Soon the entire conference room was filled with the sound. Nia stood motionless, unsure what to do with such recognition. She had spent her career working behind operating room doors where success was measured in heartbeats and recovery, not applause. Eventually, the room quieted again. Richard reached into the folder resting on the podium. He removed a framed certificate bearing the city seal. This recognition does not repay what was done, he said. It simply acknowledges it. Nia accepted the frame politely. Then she surprised everyone by stepping toward the microphone. May I say something? Richard nodded. The room fell silent once more. Nia looked across the audience. Officers, administrators, community leaders, ordinary people. What happened matters, she said softly. But what happens next matters more. Every eye remained fixed on her. We all make mistakes. Every profession, every institution. The question is whether we learn from them. The room grew even quieter. If this experience helps one person stop and listen before making an assumption, then something good can come from it. No accusation, no anger, no demand for recognition, just grace. And somehow that made the lesson impossible to ignore. 2 weeks later, Atlanta was wrapped in the gentle warmth of an early autumn evening. The air felt cooler than it had on the day everything changed. Golden leaves drifted across sidewalks. Streetlights flickered on one by one as the sun slipped below the horizon. Inside St. Matthew's Medical Center, the pace had finally slowed. The rush of the day was fading. Nurses completed reports. Cleaning crews moved quietly through empty hallways. The steady rhythm of monitors and distant footsteps created the familiar soundtrack of a hospital preparing for nightfall. Dr. Nia Brooks stood near a large window on the 7th floor, looking out over the city. The glass reflected both the skyline and her tired smile. Another long shift was ending. Another group of patients had been helped. Another day had passed. On the windowsill beside her sat a handwritten card. She had received many cards throughout her career. Most were simple thank you notes. This one felt different. The front displayed a small watercolor painting of the Atlanta skyline at sunrise. Inside, Eleanor Bennett had written only a few lines. Thank you for giving me more mornings with the people I love. Nia had read the message several times. The words were simple, yet they carried more meaning than any award hanging on a wall. A soft knock sounded behind her. She turned to find Karen Ellis standing in the doorway. You are still here? Karen asked with a smile. Nia laughed quietly. Just enjoying the view. Karen stepped beside her and looked out across the city lights. You know everyone is still talking about what happened. Nia shook her head gently. I wish they would stop. Karen laughed. That is exactly why they keep talking about it. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Outside, headlights flowed through the streets below like rivers of light. The city seemed peaceful, calm, alive. Finally, Karen pointed toward the parking lot. Looks like you have visitors. Nia followed her gaze. Near the entrance stood 3 familiar figures. Richard Bennett, Eleanor Bennett, and the young officer. They were leaving after a follow-up appointment. Eleanor moved carefully but confidently. Healthy, smiling. Beside her, Richard held the door open. The young officer carried a small bag and listened as Eleanor spoke. Then something unexpected happened. Before getting into their vehicle, all 3 looked up toward the hospital windows. They could not possibly know which window belonged to Nia. Yet somehow it felt as though they were looking directly at her. Eleanor raised a hand and waved. Nia smiled and waved back. The distance between them was too great for words. None were needed. The vehicle pulled away slowly and disappeared into the evening traffic. Karen eventually returned to her work. The hallway grew quiet again. Nia remained at the window for a few moments longer. The city stretched endlessly beneath the darkening sky. Thousands of people moving through thousands of lives. Some carrying power. Some carrying titles. Some carrying burdens nobody else could see. She thought about that afternoon at the intersection. The assumptions. The fear. The mistakes. Then she thought about what followed. Accountability. Growth. Grace. The things that mattered most had never been the uniforms, the titles, or the authority. It had always been the choices people made when faced with another human being. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the trees lining the hospital grounds. Their leaves shimmered beneath the streetlights. Nia picked up her bag, turned off the office light, and stepped into the hallway. Behind her, the city continued glowing beneath the night sky. Ahead of her, another day of helping people waited. And somewhere in Atlanta, a family sat together at dinner, grateful for an ordinary evening that almost never happened.